Silver is certainly, we're seeing increase in open interest at the COMEX. We're seeing SLV rise in quantities at the SLV, which is probably only paper, because I think all that the real silver is gone. But there's certainly, the demand is outstripping the supply dramatically.
Hello there, my friends. Chris Marcus here with you for Arcadia Economics, and I guess it must be Silver Tuesday because we're digging back into the silver market. Blessed to have my good friend and colleague Harvey Organ on, who is, as usual, digging into the gold and silver markets, which have heated up lately. We've heard reports of large SLV and ETF buyers. I've heard at the Sprott conference last week, those numbers are up to 100 million ounces over the past 2 months. So a lot going on. And Harvey, great to have you on here again today. How are you doing, my friend?
I'm doing great. It's wonderful to be with you today.
Yeah, and what a treat. We're actually talking when silver is on the rise. It hasn't happened, seems like a couple of years. Again, obviously, things getting quite chaotic in the world. Trade wars, yuan devaluations, and more attention being focused on the precious metals market. So why don't you take it from there and let everybody know what you're seeing?
Oh, certainly. Well, as you can, I spend a lot of time at the COMEX, okay, understanding what goes on there, and you're certainly seeing probably a sovereign who wants to take on the COMEX and take on as much gold as they can. Silver is certainly, we're seeing increase in open interest at the COMEX. We're seeing SLV rise in quantities at the SLV, which is probably only paper, because I think all that the real silver is gone. But there's certainly, the demand is outstripping the supply dramatically. And we're certainly having a lot of investors who are willing to take on the bankers. So it's no longer, when they smash, where it used to be 3 or 4 days to recover, it's now only probably a few minutes, just because the demand is so high. And as you see today, where they try to hit, they're failing. And the only real day they can actually do a little damage is on Friday. And the reason is that at 12 o'clock noon, London is put to bed and there's only paper. And these guys have a very, very short time vision for risk. And since they can't deliver upon on a Friday, after noon, because London's put to bed, they will kind of hit, and then you'll see prices falter a bit. But once Monday comes, as you saw Monday, bang, prices go back up, and that's very good to see in the metals. So you're seeing gold and silver certainly in the last 2 or 3 months behaving far better than it has been in the last probably 8 years. I mean, every day we're seeing dramatic. No matter what these bankers do, there are people, investors, and some maybe, who says, I'm taking whatever physical supplies. At the COMEX, or COMEX, I don't know, there's 2 ways of pronouncing this, but you're seeing Queuejumping at a great, what's the best word to say, continual. We've been certainly seeing Queuejumping in silver for the last, I would say, year and a half.
Where, Harvey, for folks who may not be familiar with that term, could you explain that?
Oh, certainly. Queuejumping, okay. It used to be, back in 1974, in the old days, if it would take 2 days for people to stand for their metal, and that would end for the whole month. So for 2 days, Monday, let's say we have first day notice. By second day notice, everything has been finalized, and that would be the contract month. Now it's taking the whole 30 days, which means, of course, that there's physical supplies are very, very shallow. Now we're seeing it's worse than that, because let's say that I'm standing for metal, for silver, and I have, let's say, 10 contracts that I'm waiting, and I'm standing and I've deposited all my money. A banker can queue jump over me, put his money down, and take silver that is there at the COMEX and give it to whoever he wants. And generally that means there's fires elsewhere. And a banker will try to put out that fire and take silver and move it to probably London or a sovereign who wants it, or somebody who desperately needs it somewhere else. And because a banker is over here and there. So when I see queue jumping, that's what it means. And so queue jumping has been, I would say, at least a year and a half every day. I have not seen it in gold until the last 2 months. And even yesterday and today, again, queue jumping. So in the last 2 days, I guess more queue jumping, which means scarcity. So there's a scarcity of metal on this side of the pond. Okay, so a banker will say he'll jump in front of me. He jumps in front of the queue to beat me, and I have to wait till the end of the month, because under laws of the COMEX, they can deliver upon me or serve upon me at the end of the 30th day or the very last day. So that's what it means by queue jumping. So when I start seeing queue jumping continually, it means scarcity. I'm going to tell you another one that I'm seeing should be a good indicator to you guys that there's some problems in silver for our dealers. Sprott has his Sprott funds, and they were always, it's a closed-end fund, and you would always see a negative, 4%, 3% negative to the net asset value. The last week, I've been seeing a positive. That is always indicative that they are in short of metal, and they're even the Sprott funds are going, not necessarily the gold. The gold is still negative, but not the silver. So it means silver is more scarce than gold. So those are the things that I'm seeing.
Well, it's certainly interesting what you mentioned there, because I know there's some skepticism about SLV says they add X number of shares. I read through the prospectus last week. You know, again, I'm not a lawyer, but at least it gives the appearance of indicating that when they're adding the new shares, they're putting physical silver in there. Again, JPMorgan's the custodian, so factor that in as you will. But either, I mean, if they're really added that much physical silver and that 100 million ounces across all the ETFs really was deposited, I'm continuing to wonder where that metal's coming from, and certainly would fit what you're mentioning, where if that metal is being physically moved or transferred, it sure would seemingly make the market pretty darn tight, you would think.
Okay, I'll answer that for you. I've done a lot of work on this SLV business, and way back in 2005, I considered it a fraud anyway, but I was alone on this. I just thought that it's just impossible. And the reason is, in the indenture, if you read it correctly, it says they're not allowed to lease. Okay, so in other words, and that's the major mechanism that these guys have. However, what it doesn't stop them from doing is swapping. So we are pretty sure that what's happened is that the banks will swap out silver or gold, doesn't matter, and put in dollars. And that bar is then hypothecated 100 times over. So and you can see when, that it has to be, is because they, especially in gold, when you start seeing 17 tons of gold coming in every day, and you know, it's an impossible they can get that kind of quantity, especially because I know in London they're massively short. They can't get them. It takes them a long time to deliver. So it means what goes into a GLD and probably an SLV are just paper. It's not real. And I wrote to the SEC, I told them it was a fraud, and they, of course, never answered.
They're not the most responsive bunch, are they?
That's zero response. They're as bad as the CFTC. CFTC doesn't respond. So I am confident that the amount of silver that they claim is there inside the SLV is very a tiny fraction of what supposedly they have there. How's that?
Yeah, which in some ways I've been wondering which would be more bullish for silver, if 100 million ounces have actually been added into these funds, or if they're saying that 100 million ounces has been added in and it hasn't. It's again such a fascinating situation because you almost think these things couldn't be going on, but then you continue to see the questions that pop up, and especially I think you commented last time, what's your current estimate for every ounce of silver, how many paper claims there are on it?
I'll put my bet on 500 to 1,000.
Okay, which, as you know, I've been doing a book about silver. That's one of the questions I asked folks, and pretty much the exact same answer everybody gave. Harvey, you mentioned the LBMA, which, especially for us Americans here, myself included, it's perhaps an even bigger black box than the COMEX. Could you talk specifically about silver, maybe some comparisons of how much actually trades in the two? You mentioned the open interest, if you have any numbers handy, but I think people get it that the amounts are big and there's a lot of wacky stuff going on, but anything you could put in context to give folks an idea of the size.
I think the last count that I remembered, I think it's higher now. In gold, it's every 2 days of trading equals 100% of the supply coming in gold. I know that's a fact. Okay, every 2 days equals 100%, and I think the silver is even worse. Now remember, the LBMA is opaque. They want to be transparent, but they're not, and it's hard to really gauge. But I think that's a good number to come with the LBMA, with the amount of contracts and what's behind it and everything in the LBMA. I think every 2 days equals 100% of supply. Supply on this side of the total silver is about 700 million ounces, ex Russia, ex China. I don't include those two countries because nothing ever gets out. So you can take it from there. And gold is 3,500 ounces. 3,500 tons, ex China, ex Russia. China is about 407 tons. Russia's about a little over 300 tons. That's 700 tons, so that should give you a rough idea as to the gold, okay? And so I take ex-Russia, ex-China. Every 2 days, I get something. That's what their turnover, they call it turnover. Whether you believe it or not, I don't know, but that's just what they give it. I think the more important data coming from the is what is transferred through the exchange for physicals, because that is a problem. And they have their own, and certainly exchange for physicals move from over here at the COMEX to London, and that's certainly having an effect. And what I think is going on now is that traders are exercising their exchange for physicals and not allowing these things to trade, and turning back to the banks and say, now give me my metal. Mm-hmm. And that is what's scaring the banks now. And I am pretty sure that that's the phenomenon that's happening. I think Andrew has a much better, because he's over in London and he sees this, and I'm pretty sure this is what he says going on. So I'm going to take his word for it. But that's what's going on.
Yeah, it's it's fascinating, and you want, especially because you mentioned how people are coming and asking for their gold. Again, for the last 8 years, we've seen very little interest in gold and silver from a mainstream perspective. And while I would argue that not much really has substantially changed, yeah, the banks have been printing money. They've been doing that all along. Yet, for whatever reasons you want to put on it, it is interesting how the media is now talking about gold as if it's cool again. We hear, look, Ray Dalio's buying gold, which he was doing about over a year and a half ago. But again, there's a lot of attention being placed in the mainstream, and certainly the reasons to buy gold are there. So I've noticed the same thing you mentioned earlier, how the raids, it seems like when normally we have these spikes down, it's as if there's a lot less strength behind them. And perhaps that's just the general market demand, or perhaps in silver, we've heard a bit about a big whale, whether that's China, JPMorgan, a hedge fund, a sovereign, or otherwise. I mean, at the very least, we can see on JPMorgan's COMEX report, they have, 153 million ounces for somebody, whether it's them or a client.
Well, that's been confirmed to me by the CFTC. That's true.
And what did they say, that it's being held for JPMorgan, or that it's for a client, or what were they able to share on that one?
Well, you know my theory. I've been suggesting since 2009 that the silver, that what happened was, I believe that China lent the United States silver approximately 1 billion ounces in the year 2003. And that's how China got into the WTO and became a favored nation. That was very good for China because they looked at it and said, they really want gold. They were always a silver nation from the 1600s. They were storing the gold, and Mao Zedong didn't know what to do with it. He locked it up, and for years it was sitting there in a vault. They didn't know what to do with it. It was a Western phenomenon. So when the United States when the United States used up their Manhattan silver, which is about 2 billion ounces, they had in 1990 about 2 billion ounces, and by the year 2003 it was used up. So there's no question that the United States came knocking on China and says, listen, I hear you got lots of silver. You give me your silver, and then you get favored nation, and we'll go to town. Great deal. And China became a very strong nation in trading. They gave up a lot of the silver, but it was a lent, and that silver they want it back. And I think that's why JPMorgan has been putting it in their vault. Now, interestingly enough, JPMorgan's vault is owned by China, so it's on Liberty Street, and that silver, which is about 180 million. I think that's the last count.
Didn't China buy the JPMorgan headquarters building as well?
That's it. That's the one. Yeah. Oh, they bought the headquarters. Yes. Yeah, but the vault is owned. The vault that the silver is in is owned by China. So in my discussions with the CFTC, of course, I argued with the CFTC that it's illegal for JPMorgan, regardless, to pick up silver when it's cheap, when they are the massive short. And they are. They agreed to me that they are the massive short, but they said it's legal. I said it's illegal. And we had a real fight. And then all of a sudden he says, who says that JPMorgan owns that silver? And I said, oh, you're talking with my line, because I always told him that the silver really didn't belong to JPMorgan. Probably belongs to the United States government. The United States government owes China. And then all of a sudden you got Trump doing his stuff, and then China doesn't know how to handle this thing. It's got tariffs and everything else to deal with, and it lent all this silver, which it wants back. So, I mean, this is why we're in a state of flux where everything is happening. China wants it back. China doesn't certainly want its tariffs, and certainly China is. Then China gets today or last night for being manipulating their currency. And the funny part about it is they're manipulating.
A week after Trump pressures the Fed into lowering interest rates, of course.
Yeah, but they're manipulating their currency higher. If I was Kyle Bass writes, it probably is correct that their currency is probably 40% overvalued now. So really, China wanted to lower it correctly what it was, and then all of a sudden Trump goes and says, "You're a manipulator," you know? And all of a sudden China says, "What do I do here?" You know, and they probably have agreements not to state that they have lent all the silver, so China has to keep it. So that's the state of affairs over on that side. So we're in a lot of fun.
Yeah, I remember you mentioned that the last time we talked, so I was curious to dig into that again. Any idea, you said that China sent over 1 billion ounces. Was that from a government stockpile that they had? And if so, was that all of it, or was there more, or any idea?
Oh, okay. If you go back to China from the 1600s were massive silver producers. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, in the 1980s, I think that they were refining close to 80 to 85% of the world's silver. The problem to the West was that China decided to keep that silver. So if a miner put the silver in, he would not get it back. All he got is paper money back. And a lot of guys wanted their actual silver. So that kind of stopped that. And now China's roughly about 40%. But if you go back to the year 1600 and how much they produced over all these years and stored it and everything else, you could probably guess 2 to 2.5 billion ounces of silver was probably in their vaults in the year 2002. Especially from 1949 on, because they never used any. They produced it. They kept their mines going, but they just didn't. They just kept it in a vault, and it kept going. And then finally, that's when the United States knew about this and said, "Hey, we came knocking on the door." So probably they took 1 billion of that, of the 2, and now China wants it back. They realize that's good because they now use it for their photoelectric cells. They're for power and things, and using it for pharmaceuticals. Lots of usage for silver. But in answer to your question, it's been over 400 years, and the only official nation that I know of for silver was China. No other nation on earth was a silver nation.
Right.
And this is, you can just see in the coins that they made in 1935. Of course, they call them the junk silver coins, and then that was 35. And that was probably the last years that were really made. Once communist China took over, it just stopped. So I hope I answered that, but I'm pretty sure that's what went on.
Yeah, well, you did, because it's so fascinating that in the middle of this trade war, which I continue to be baffled by, trade wars against your largest creditors and excuse me, going back and forth while both nations have credit concerns, yet to the degree that, if you want to call last night a currency or 2 nights ago a currency retaliation or whatever it is, certainly an option that China has is the silver market here, because you look at U.S. government, everything they do at this point is based on printed and borrowed money. And really, if you wanted to end the U.S. economically overnight, I mean, here's a very vulnerable area, and we'll see how it all shakes out. One last note I have for you before we wrap up, just found it interesting. I was noticing that Warren Buffett made a big investment in JPMorgan. It was about half a year ago. And to the degree that JPMorgan is holding some of that silver, interesting to think that Warren Buffett could have been getting long silver again, and especially with his holdings in the late 90s into the early 2000s.
He did, yeah.
Just fascinating the things that are going on.
He did. He's the one that bought a lot of silver, wasn't it? Back in late 1900s, 1997, was it?
I think it was 1998. And
yeah.
Again, for any of the folks, I know it's not as well publicized, but this isn't, my imagination or conspiracy theory. You can actually go and watch Warren Buffett talk about silver. I think it was 1998 in one of his shareholder meetings. It was interesting because everything he said to where I was buying silver then is even more extreme now.
His father was a gold bug.
Oh, yes.
His father was a very serious gold buff, as Trump. Trump's father, Fred Trump, was a gold buff and a silver buff. So more gold. But anyway, so it's interesting. Would Buffett buy? I don't think so. It really goes against what he's said. Lately, he says that it's a relic of the past, and I think he's nuts. But anyway, I don't think he bought it for that reason. He's generally because he bought Wells Fargo. He's not very happy with what he did with Wells Fargo. But I think you can discount that by 99%. Okay, he did not buy it for the silver. That's just not him.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting, all these things that are going on in the market. And Harvey, again, I appreciate your time and checking in. Perhaps just wrapping up, you can let folks know how they can find you.
Yeah, I write every day, Monday through Friday. I publish at about 5:30, and you can see me at www.harveyorganwordpress.com. And it's free, and it's open to the public. Although it's mainly dealing with the shenanigans at the COMEX. So that I spend most of my time on that, and then other stories which will influence silver and gold. But so it's a little technical in nature, but those guys that are certainly like the technical stuff, it's there for you. Okay.
Yeah, well, certainly will be interesting to check in again in the months ahead, whether are close to some sort of big move or short squeeze. Again, we'll see, but a lot of fascinating things happening, and I really appreciate that you keep people posted, digging through that data and letting them know what's going on. So thanks again, and we will check in with you again soon.
Thanks for having me.